on steep cliffs, where the land tore itself apart, where winds sang mournful songs, and birds circled like doubts, there grew a single tree, no forest, no grove, no comforting thicket, just one sapling, small and stubborn, clinging to a narrow ledge above the abyss. Beneath it, a chasm shrouded in fog and stone. Above it, jagged peaks like shards of the sky. The villagers who passed by said it was foolish. That tree, they said, was born in the wrong place. Children threw pebbles at it, testing its stillness. Shepherds kept count of its days, certain that one morning they would find it gone, swept into the depths. But the tree held on. Its roots, denied soft soil, found cracks in the rock. Its trunk, with no protection from others, listened to the wind and learned its rhythm. It bent when it had to, and straightened when it could. In its first year, it survived a frost that burned the valley below. In its second, a drought turned fields to dust. But the tree, nourished by mist and secret veins of water, remained green. By the third year, its shadow grew long enough to be noticed, not for beauty, nor blossoms, nor fruit, but for presence, for perseverance. Still some mocked. "It will never bear fruit," said a farmer. "It can grow no higher," murmured a scholar. "It will fall," declared a priest. Everything does, but the tree did not listen. It had no ears, only bark and breath, sap and silence. And in that silence, something ancient stirred. Not defiance, but purpose. A bird came once, wind-worn and weary. It stayed briefly, then flew on. Another came, then more. The tree learned stillness, not as waiting, but as being. Storms clawed at it. Snow bowed its limbs. But each trial left not ruin, but a lesson. The roots gripped tighter. The trunk grew stronger. What didn't break it, shaped it. And high on the edge of the cliff, a quiet truth grew. The place that seemed most hostile had made it strong. The fourth year came with a sky like steel. Clouds boiled over the peaks, and thunder broke the silence with the voice of gods long forgotten. The tree stood alone on its ledge, as it always had. But now the wind did not dance, it roared. The first storm came, like a test. Rain lashed the trunk, trying to strip it of bark. The wind tore at its branches, bending them until they cracked, but not broke. Lightning seared the sky, close enough to blind, far enough to spare. The tree trembled, but it did not fall. After the storm passed, it stood stripped, leaves scattered like whispers. But the trunk remained, and the roots, unseen, had grown deeper in silence. Then came another. This storm brought hail, sharp as spite, and cold that pierced the marrow of wood. The tree bent again, lower this time, its limbs curled like fingers over stone. It endured, not through strength, but through surrender, through learning. And between each storm, brief calm returned. The sky cleared in pieces. Birds landed, then fled, Moss clung closer to the bark. The cliff grew wetter, narrower, and yet the tree remained. But something else began to happen. The tree started changing, not just in form, but in memory. The grooves in its bark remembered each gust, each lash. The angles of its limbs learned the shape of the wind. Where once it stood fragile, now it leaned. Not away, but into the storm. It did not resist blindly. It studied. It absorbed. Each storm was a teacher, cruel but clear, and the tree born on the edge began to learn the dance of survival, not to defy the storm, but to move with it. By the 7th year, its branches grew slower, but stronger, thicker, not sprawling like forest trees, but focused like hands that had grasped the edge and refused to let go. Below, the abyss yawned. Above, the storms prepared their return. But now, when the wind came howling, the tree did not fear. It listened, it learned, and it leaned into the gale, not to fall, but to grow. The 8th spring came, and the tree stood taller. Its branches did not reach for elegance, but for balance. Its bark, weathered and dark, held the memory of lightning and rain. It no longer looked young, but it did not look weak. Still, others did not understand. In the forest, down the slope, among gentler hills and softer soil, trees grew tall in the safety of numbers. Their canopies mingled, their roots wrapped around one another like families in sleep. They knew little of wind beyond whispers, and they laughed. They saw the lone tree on the cliff, gnarled and bent, and called it twisted. "It clings like a weed," said one pine. "It strains upward only because it has nothing to shade it," said an elm. "It survives because no one wants its place," scoffed a cedar. The tree heard none of this, but it did feel the wind differently. It noticed how its branches no longer fought the gusts. They danced with them. How its leaves no longer tore in storms. They folded, flexed, flowed. The mockery didn't matter, not because it wasn't heard, but because it wasn't needed. And yet, a young sapling near the forest edge watched with quiet awe. "Why doesn't it fall?" the sapling asked the elder trees. "Because it's stubborn," they replied. "Because it's foolish. Because it's alone." But the sapling wasn't satisfied. That night, a breeze crept through the forest, faint but telling. The young tree leaned slightly toward the cliff, not away. Something inside it had shifted, not roots, but curiosity. Meanwhile, the cliff tree stood through another season of wind, quiet and unshaken. Birds returned to its branches. Moss softened its northern side. Even foxes passed beneath it now, treating its roots like a marker between the known and the perilous. And still, the forest trees laughed. But higher on the ridge, where no other tree dared grow, one stood, bent but balanced, scarred but whole. Mocked not because it failed, but because it endured. It came without warning, not a seasoned storm, nor a passing tempest, but a fury from the belly of the world, winds that howled with the voice of ancient hunger, rain that didn't fall, but attacked, lightning not as flash, but as flame, a storm that sought to unmake. The trees in the forest below moaned under the weight of it. The tallest were the first to fall, ripped from soil that had never asked them to hold on tight. Their roots, shallow and sprawling, tore out in sheets. Canopies tangled and snapped, birds fled, nests scattered, the ground became chaos. But on the cliff, where the sky met stone and wind had always had its way, the lone tree stood. It bent lower than ever before. Its branches thrashed. One snapped, then another. Rain soaked its very marrow. The wind screamed, trying to lift it from the earth like a weed. But the roots were too deep, and the tree did not panic. It had danced with storms before. This was no longer its enemy. It was its final teacher. For 3 nights, the storm raged. The forest suffered. Hills bled mud into rivers. Paths vanished. Livestock were lost. People prayed, not for survival, but for mourning. And when dawn came, pale and limping, the destruction revealed itself. Half the forest lay broken. The meadow was drowned. Homes shattered. But there, on the cliff, bathed in bruised light, the tree remained, shorn, scarred, shivering, but alive. People climbed the path that day, not to see if it had survived, but to understand why it had. They stood before it, silent. No one laughed now. No one mocked. A shepherd touched the bark, rough and furrowed, but steady. A child nestled at its base. A traveler from a distant valley knelt, whispering thanks. And the tree, though silent, spoke. It spoke through its posture, through the echo of its endurance, not in pride, not in triumph, but in presence. A quiet kind of truth that said, I was broken, but not undone. And that is enough. The storm had not spared the tree, but it had revealed it. Weeks after the great storm, the mountains were still healing. Mudslides carved new paths down the valleys. Trails disappeared. Springs changed their course. Some villages mourned, others rebuilt, and one afternoon, as the mist returned to the cliffs like a memory, a man appeared, wounded, limping, soaked to the bone. He had been lost for 2 days, disoriented by broken paths and rising fog. He'd eaten nothing. His hands bled from climbing stones. His breath was shallow, his eyes wild with fear. He stumbled forward until his fingers touched bark. The tree, he hadn't known it was there. He had crawled upward by instinct, by desperation. But when his weight sagged against the trunk, something in him stilled. The bark scraped his skin, but it grounded his panic. He looked up. The branches arched above, like weathered arms. The roots surrounded him, like old bones. He wept, not from pain, but from safety. The tree, unmoving, held him, as it had held itself, through all storms, not in warmth, but in presence. It did not cradle, it did not shelter, but it did not abandon. The man collapsed beneath it and slept. By dawn, villagers from the valley found him. They had been searching for 2 days. They carried him down with reverence, not just for the man, but for the place where they found him.
Afterward, people began visiting the tree, not only out of awe, but gratitude.
They left tokens at its roots, pieces of ribbon, stones with names, folded letters, not prayers, reminders. Children played near its base now. Elders rested on its roots. One woman painted it each season, never the same way twice. And though the tree never moved, never spoke, it became something new, not just a survivor, but a sanctuary. It had been broken, it had been mocked, but now it had saved, not by trying, but simply by being what it was. The tree had never spoken, and yet it was now called wise.
No declaration.
No leaves that shimmered with magic, just shade and silence that pulled people closer. They came not only for rest, but reflection. To sit at its roots was not to receive answers, but to ask better questions.
A boy who had quarreled with his brother sat beneath the tree one afternoon.
He brought no apology, only guilt. Hours passed. He returned home without a word, but the next day he offered his brother half his bread. An old man brought a cane and a regret, a debt unpaid to a friend now gone. He left a coin beneath the roots, not for repayment, but remembrance. Once, a group of pilgrims arrived. They circled the tree and chanted, asking for miracles. The tree offered none, but when they left, one lingered, silent, kneeling, hands in the soil. "It is enough," she whispered. "It lives." Children began to ask their parents, not what the tree was, but why it stood. And though answers varied, one word kept returning: endurance. No one knew when the custom began, but over time, people brought stones, not offerings, symbols. They etched a date, or a name, or a question. Some left them in piles. Others built small circles. A kind of shrine grew, not to power, but to presence. And the tree stood in its shadow, patient, unchanged, except that it had changed. Its bark, once coarse and cracked, now shimmered in places with lichen. Its branches, once clawing skyward, now bent slightly outward, forming a partial canopy. Its roots, once desperate to clutch the cliff, now seemed to embrace it. The tree had not grown taller, but it had grown deeper. One poet called it a silence that listens back. A carpenter built a bench nearby, facing not the tree, but the abyss behind it. "To see what it sees," he said. And so, the tree gave nothing, promised nothing, and became, somehow, everything: a mirror of struggle, a sculpture of survival, a teacher without words. Wisdom had taken root, not in the tree alone, but in those who sat in its shadow. The tree had no name, but everyone knew where it stood. Its story was told, not in books, but in gestures. A touch to the bark meant, "Even member." A stone placed nearby meant, "I have endured." A pause before it, no words, only breath, meant, "I am listening." Time passed. Generations shifted like seasons. Children who had once played in its roots brought their own children. Some travelers came seeking mystery. Others stumbled upon it as if by fate. One autumn, as the wind carried leaves like whispers, a child asked her grandmother, "Why doesn't it speak?" The woman smiled and said, "It does. Just not with words we're used to." That night, the wind rose, not violently, but with voice. It moved through the branches, through the hollowed places of bark, through the stones and offerings left behind. It didn't sing. It didn't shout. It spoke, not in commands, nor riddles, but in a question given back to every heart: what have you survived, and who have you become because of it? And all who stood near heard it, each in their own way. A boy who had been bullied heard, "You are more than their names for you." A mother mourning her child heard, "You carried love farther than pain could follow." An old warrior heard, "You laid down your sword, and that was your greatest strength." Even those who came to mock grew quiet. The wind found its way into them too, not through confrontation, but reflection. One night, a painter came. She brought no brush, only sat, and then wept. Later, she would write in her journal, "The tree said nothing, but I heard everything." Eventually, the tree died, not suddenly, not tragically, just gently. The way stories end, when they've been fully told, its trunk hollowed with time. The leaves grew sparse. One spring, no buds came, and people gathered, not in mourning, but in gratitude. They did not build a fence. They did not carve its wood. They let it stand, as it had always done, in silence. And still, long after its last leaf fell, the wind returned. Passing through the bare branches, it carried not sorrow, but echo, a breath remembered. Children asked, "Will it grow again?" And someone always answered, "It already has, in us." For what did not kill it had made it stronger, and what made it stronger had made them whole.